let me get my materials here. So our session now is the UP Politics Roundtable, featuring David Haynes, former president of the Northern Michigan University, Pat Gagliardi, former member of the House of Representatives and the Democratic floor leader, and Mitch Irwin, the Democratic member of the Michigan Senate, who we have on a taped interview. These gentlemen have very, very long biographies. I don't want to read them entirely. What I would say is that you should go to our schedule site. You can click on the bio link there, and you'll be able to read all about them. But David Haynes was the former president here at the university. I worked with him. I've been working with him ever since I got here, and a great supporter of our heritage and the Beaumier Center. I want to thank you, David. You played a major role in us having our wonderful home here in Grease Hall, which has turned out to be a pretty darn good place to be for us. And I really appreciate your help with making that happen. And Pat, thanks for joining us. I'm just there's a lot to talk about here. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, David.
All right, well, thank you. Good morning. I want to say welcome to my good friend, Pat Gagliardi, who is the current chair of the Michigan Liquor Control Commission and a resident of Drummond Island. Good morning, Pat. And Pat will be giving you a really interesting perspective from a live perspective of a legislator in the UP. As a matter of fact, at the age of Pat and I think I'm older. Anytime you describe it as live, it's a good thing. It means we're actually making it. And then we'll be joined by videotape with Senator Mitch Irwin, who is from the eastern end of the UP also, and Rudyard, both graduates of Lake Superior State University, and I am of Northern Michigan University. So what we all decided we would do in talking to Dan was we would focus on a period of time about inside or outside to give you a perspective. 1975 to 1995. It was a different era, right? It was pre-term limits. It was a whole different world out there than we have now in some ways. In other ways, it's very similar. The UP delegation was a very powerful delegation. The same amount of numbers as we have now, 4 state reps, 2 state senators, but they really specialized and focused in on networking and building coalitions on both sides of the aisle. I started my career working in the Michigan Senate as a staffer and eventually in the administration of Governor Blanchard. I watched that networking. I watched when you were from the UP, how other people from the UP took care of you. I wasn't born and raised in the UP, but I am a graduate of Northern and have spent 40 some odd years here. I watched that cultural difference, but I also watched people like Pat Gagliardi, Mitch Irwin, and Dominic Jacobetti focus on how they built coalitions with Detroit, how they built coalitions with Lansing. I also want to say, while we're beginning, and I'm going to not spend too much time and turn it over to Pat to talk about inside, outside, most of the Republican legislators from this era, we discovered were as they say, have gone on to join the ancestors. They have passed on. Otherwise, we would have asked them to join in. And as soon as I say that, and Pat says it, we're going to hear from one of them that they haven't joined the ancestors. They're alive, living in Naples, Florida or something, and we'll have to eat our words. But as far as we know, when checking, we did that as time progresses on. So let me just say that this is post-Watergate. This is a period of time when young legislators and young members of Congress were elected post-Watergate. It was a youthful time. Should also say that Dominic Jacobetti in 1975, after the defeat of the powerful chairman of House Appropriations, Dominic becomes the chairman No one expected this defeat of this powerful man from downstate. And Jake assumes a new throne, a new power, and did it well. We often focus with Jake on stories about Jake, but then Jake was a substantive, talented budget manager and political public policy craftsman. He understood it. He knew how to do that. I think one of the great messages I would give is those of you who visit our campuses in the UP would have to say from the era of Gagliardi, Irwin, Jacobetti, Connors, Coivisto, Max, we built huge campuses here. But we built huge campuses here because the UP delegation built a coalition with, excuse the noise outside, it built a huge coalition with Detroit legislators, the powerful chairman of Higher Ed Subcommittee, Morris Hood, Sr. And what they did was not just build up the campuses of the UP, they built up the campuses of Detroit around the state. They said, let's join together because we only have 4 or 5 votes in the UP in the House. And they built this huge coalition with Detroit legislators and later with others. So that networking is an interesting thing that Pat and Mitch will talk about. And the other thing I would talk about during that era is when we get into the 80s, Dominic Jacobetti all of a sudden is faced with during this period of time, we had Republican and Democratic governors, but the Senate changed hands. And in 1983, the Republicans took control of the Senate. And the new chairperson of the Senate Appropriation Committee was none other than Harry Gass from Southwest Michigan. And he and Jake had a relationship from their days in the House. And they built a huge coalition where they said, we can move things through together if we can build the votes. And I think that is the message from this era when we listen to Pat and Mitch. I just do want to say one thing about the power of being in the majority, whatever majority you're in, Republican or Democratic, and being in powerful positions. Pat Gagliardi was the second ranking in person in the House as majority floor leader. Dominic Jacobetti was the chair of appropriations. Mitch Irwin was chair of the DNR committees and a powerful player. I just want to tell you one story, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mitch. Over to Pat. And after Pat's done, we'll go to Mitch. I was working for Northern, representing Northern, and at the time, we had a capital outlay request. And at this time, what we wanted was something different than Chairman Jacobetti wanted. Chairman Jacobetti took care of me and was my mentor. I got a call in from the governor's office where I worked and said, listen, you're going to get your appropriation request. And I said, great. And they said, but it's not the project you and the president prioritized. And I said, well, what is it? And they said, the new dome. I said, well, that's really not the board and the president's priority. The governor said to me, pay attention here. Listen, I just told you the chairman wants the dome and has the votes. You don't want the dome, you get nothing. We took the dome, and the dome was a huge success at a big part of Northern, but that is the power, what I consider constructive power, the positive power of a person like Dominic Jacobetti. It wasn't about doing things to feather Dominic's life or Pat Gagliardi's, who would help us get that through, or Mitch Irwin. It was about what was doing best, what was they figured was best for the UP and their understanding of the people in the UP and listening to all of us. So let's turn over to Pat. I mean, Pat obviously elected in 1983. Mitch Irwin's elected in 1979. They come out of the Sioux. As I said, the new young Turks, if you will, of that time, and power became major power brokers along with Dominic Jacobetti, Representative Jacobetti, and understood how to keep the insider-outsider relationship, how to still represent the people of the UP and still be able to be if you will, a major important policy person and political person in the state legislature. So Pat, Mr. Chairman, glad to see you. Very impressive background with the flags and everything there. It's good to see you. And I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, David. Nice introduction, and it's always good to be with a group affiliated with one of our great universities and one of our great UPR universities, Northern Michigan University. We have a great background here because I'm a big believer in promoting the place where you live, and I live in Michigan, so you see, and in the United States, you see our flags because we are one country, and as we are taping this today, I hope we can stick together as one country. Going back to when I was elected in 1982, the delegation was an incredible cast of characters and great politicians. Our congressman was Bob Davis, longtime congressman out of the area. I beat his son, Bob Davis Jr. in 1982, which nobody predicted. I had the support of three UPR legislators, Mitch Irwin, Don Jacobetti, and Don Koivisto, and pulled an upset. And I walked into a delegation that had Bob as our congressperson. We had Joe Mack in the Senate. We had Mitch Irwin in the Senate. Of course, Mitch and I went below the bridge too. We had Don Koivisto. We had Jack Gingras out of Iron Mountain, and we had Don Jacobetti, and really learned so much from all of those people. Even Bob and I had a good relationship, even though I was able to beat his son for the House seat on the East End. And I think the key to what you said when listening to your introduction of this program, different than it is now, is people learned how to build coalitions. And I think one of the things that's hurt us so much in the last 20 years has been a thing called term limits. Legislators don't get to stay there long enough to develop the relationships that we were able to develop. And when you develop a relationship with another person, the opportunity to get more things done is terrific because you know each other. You have some friendship with each other. You know their families. You know what their interests are. And we had that opportunity, and it was a great experience. Don Jacobetti was my mentor. 1982, I get elected. 2 days later, I come to the legislature, David. There's a big election for Speaker of the House between Gary Owen and Joe Forbes, two people you know well. So I came down to make sure that the UPR delegation knew I was going to be with them. And they were all for Gary Owen. But my last meeting was that night with Jake. And Linda Benedict found me, got me over to the old Pay King, which is no longer there. And in the back booth of the Pay King are Earl Nelson, former state senator from Lansing, Morris Hood Jr., the leader of the Detroit delegation, probably outside of Coleman Young, the most powerful politician of that era in Michigan from Detroit, and Don Jacobetti. So I sit down and have a drink with him, and Jake pulls me over to another booth and he says, well, I want to go over a couple things with you. And he says, I see that guy over there, that's Morris Hood. He's our friend. We vote with him, he votes with us. At that time, they had about 18 votes and we had 4. Well, that gets you towards half the votes you need of 56 to get something out of the House. So really early on, I understood what he was saying. We build coalitions here to help each other. And what I found out later, the city of Detroit and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan almost had the same type of statistics as the poverty, elderly, unemployment, real similar kind of stats. Percentage-wise, Detroit was much bigger, of course. So that's just an indication back to what you said about how he worked. He worked at building coalitions. And that taught all of us younger folks, we can get more done if we try and pull people together than what we seem to be going through now, where we split people apart and you're either a Democrat or Republican, you don't vote for anything the other side has. It doesn't allow for either side that has good ideas. Nobody has the complete, what would you call it? The complete hold on all the good ideas. There are good ideas on all sides. And he was a great mentor that way. The second thing you might find interesting in that conversation is he said, you go in the morning and talk to Gary Owen and tell him you're going to vote for him. I said, you bet. He said, remember, this isn't a done deal. And you want him to know you were with him before it's a done deal and he's going to win. Sure enough, the horse was right. About 48 hours later, it was a done deal. Gary was the speaker and he never forgot the Yoopers in that whole situation. We backed the right horse. And of course that gave us the Speaker of the House as an ex officio member of our delegation. So is there anything else you'd like to cover? I mean, I've got Jake's stories that won't end. I've got stories about all the people there. I mean, I lived for 4 years with Don Koivisto. Mitch Irwin and I kind of grew up together. So whatever you'd like to fall into, I'd be happy to do.
So Pat, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of representing the interests of your district, which was from the Sioux down below the bridge for several counties, and being a leader and having to step in to get things through that might not have been so popular in your district, the outsider insider. How do you balance that out? How do you keep the ear?
I think you have to earn the trust of the voters. When I became leader think about that, David, it was the end of my 6th year there. Now you would be term limited out, and I was called too young to be the majority floor leader. I went up against a guy named Lynn John Dahl, who had been there 14 years. And the whole run against me is Gagliardi had only been there 6 years. He hasn't been there long enough. He's too green. Now think about it. We're pumping people out the door after 6 years. This term limits thing has been bad for the state of Michigan. I'm just telling you. If you get a good legislator like the UP had and the public wants to keep them and keep them in, let them vote them in. You got term limits every 2 to 4 years in this state. The public goes in and votes. The president is learning that there are term limits. Everybody, the term limits are at the ballot box. And so to your point, I'm running against Lynn John Dahl for a majority floor leader. Dominic, I said I would not run. I had a conversation with him unless he nominated me in caucus. He did, and I won by 1 vote. So I become floor leader, inside outsider. My very first day officially as floor leader, we're organizing in January of '93. Everybody picks their seat. We do some perfunctory stuff, raise our hand, take the oath of office and oath to the United States and the Michigan Constitution. And we have 1 vote. It's a SOC commission vote, the State Officers Compensation Committee vote. They had given the legislature a raise. The only way it didn't go into effect was if the legislature turned it down. Legislature wanted to turn it down. It wasn't popular with the people. So I put it up for a vote as a floor leader, and I vote against it. And the speaker at that time, my good friend Lou Dodak, reaches over and says, Patty, he says, you've got to vote green on this. I said, why, Lou? This is a terrible vote. The people don't want it. He said, no, now that you're a leader, you have to show that you believe that these people are worth the money. So as leaders, we say, yes, they're worth the money and it'll go down anyway. I said, that's a terrible vote. And he said, Patty, that'll be the first of many shitty votes you will make as leader in this legislature. And so insider, outsider, leadership, the only way I could make those votes and stay there is if the people back home believed I was doing the job for them. And they understood that you have to do things sometimes that doesn't look like it's in their favor to get something that is in their favor. Going back to your story about the Yooper Dome, the Jacobetti Dome, the Superior Dome. I mean, you and the president at the time had to make a decision that didn't look good to your board, but was good in the long term. and people had to have trust in your decision-making.
So Pat, just before we go to Mitch, and then we'll get you to react to Mitch's comments, but what do you think is, besides term limits? It seems to me that you're there for 6 years, term limits is bad. You have less incentive to build relationships and coalitions because you're going to be leaving unless you run for the next sort of the Senate or the Senate of the House. What are the differences and challenges that you all in this era faced and legislators from the UP and other places face today? What are the differences? What are the similarities?
I think not only is term limits bad in general, but term limits doesn't allow for seniority from rural places. Look at the leadership in the Senate of the United States Senate. It's Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, been there forever, been the leader. If you get seniority in our system, every other legislator will look at you with respect, whether they like you, don't like you. If you can prove that the public you represent will support you and continue to support you, that gets a lot of respect. Seniority matters. Dominic Jacobetti in 75 became the chairman of appropriations because he'd been there a long time, 20 years by then, and people respected him. They saw him coming back. Remember when Jake was elected in the early 50s, I think it's 54, that district that he came from was not a Democratic district. They put him up on the ballot to run a Democrat, and he went on the ballot to win a district, which he did, and help start to get people to understand that Democrats had good ideas too. And he worked real hard at it over the years. By the time you get to the mid 70s, David, he's got enough respect in Lansing that when Bill Copeland, the powerful chairman, loses in an election, once again, it all goes back to you have the respect of the people you represent. Jake is put in that chair because people respected him. He'd been around a long time. People from the UP don't have that time now. They've got 6 years or 8 years in their respective places and they're gone. There's no, and think about what I told you about working with Detroit and Morris Hood. Morris had been there better part of 20 years, like Jake in the mid 70s. So he'd been there 10 years. And so he had respect from the people he served with because he had proven that he could get the support of the people that send him there and they would keep him there. And so you had to deal with them.
Sorry about that. I had it on mute. Thank you. I think that's really, really interesting perspective. One last quick question, and then we'll go to Mitch. What was the biggest myth about the UP? On our website, ruralinsights.org, we often talk about, just like not all metropolitan areas are the same, not all rural areas are the same issues, same people. The last panel was talking about this more cultural. What was the biggest myth you had to fight? What was about the UP?
Well, that we pulled all our women around by the hair. I say that jokingly. I think anytime a lot of people in urban areas look at rural areas, they think we're a little less sophisticated. But I think the biggest problem you had to understand is the UP is so large. You go from the east end of Drummond Island over to Ironwood, you're talking about going 380 miles. I mean, that's as long as for me to get out of my car when I'm at the state capitol, and I can drive past Pittsburgh, or I can drive past Louisville. I can drive way past Chicago from Lansing at 380 miles. I think the biggest problem we had was to try and tell people we had different regions. I can tell you to this day, I am in Lansing today. If there's a snowstorm up where Mr. Truckee comes from, they'll say, "Oh man, Pat, you guys got 20 inches of snow." I said, "No, we had a balmy day over in the East End." They have no idea the enormity of geography to cover. They have no idea that each region, so often our forefathers broke us into East, Central, and West for a good reason, because there were different people, different cultures, different businesses. And I think that's why Michigan Tech, Northern, Lake Superior have done so well. They really kind of cover those regions. We're a big, massive area, going back to what was being talked about before. We have a lot to offer, but it's different in each area. And that's a hard thing to get people to. They say, I've got a cousin up in Calumet. Well, you know, from where I live, it's about 350 miles to Calumet. You know, okay, yeah, do you know my cousin? You know, so it's the enormity of our geography and the fact that all those areas from the western to the eastern area are all different. They're different ethnic makeups, different business makeups, different cultures. And so I think getting past that and understanding that was so neat about working with the delegation when I came in. You had all of us were kind of from varying backgrounds and all people that you could learn from.
Thanks, Pat. That was really interesting. I'm going to come back to you for more perspective after we run the Mitch Irwin interview that I did with Mitch. Dan, can you run that for us?
Yes, I will start that right now.
You're a great American. Thank you.
Oh, amazing how we do this. Good afternoon, everybody. Today,
can you hear that?
Yes, I can hear it.
You could hear it. Okay, I had to get my here. I'm going to try to get better sound here. Just a second.
We're joined.
There we go.
We're joined by a very good friend of mine. We grew up together here in the UP. It's the former senator from the 37th district and in the eastern UP and below, Mitch Irwin. And I will do a little deeper introduction of Mitch. Before you watch this video, you will have heard it. But Mitch also, besides being a state senator, served as under Governor Granholm as the Director of Management and Budget for the department. So he's got a long history and experience in state government. And he also grew up in Rudyard. And so he understands the values of the peninsula, and he understands how to function and how to protect the issues of people in the peninsula, and was very effective for that reason in the political process. So the theme of all of this is outsider insider. So I'm going to ask Mitch I'm just going to throw out the first question, and I'm going to let him go, and I may jump in with more questions. And the first question, Mitch, is first of all, is welcome and thank you for doing this. How did you balance out the being in, you know, in order to get elected, you were an insider in the UP, clearly. And secondly, you were an outsider to Lansing. Eventually, you become an insider in Lansing, as well as an insider in the Seward, but it's outsider insider. So I'd like to have you just start talking about that and how that era you were in from 1975. You were elected in 1978, I think.
Yes, correct.
And that was an era, by the way, for everyone here, that a lot of young men and women post-74 Watergate era of both parties were elected. And the state legislature, Mitch was part of that movement, that they were from downstate and up here were these new young men and women who were stepping into government. So talk about that connection between the UP and Lansing and building it and how you did that.
Well, thank you, David. This opportunity is mine, and appreciate your pulling this kind of a program together. I think over the years, I've been both an outsider and an insider. When I started in government, I was an outsider knocking on doors, and then got real close to and became elected myself in the political process. And years later, back outside now. I'd be a true outsider now. We do hotel development throughout the state. And watching it, it's very clear to me that the key to that whole relationship between the insiders and the outsiders is communication through relationships. And I watched over the years when I got first involved in politics, government, we were represented by a group of lawmakers from the Upper Peninsula who were there for a long, long time. When I first got elected, I was the first new lawmaker in the Upper Peninsula in 16 years. There were members that served in the legislature, served very well, I might add, longer than I had been alive. So it was kind of new to them, new to me. We had some bumps in the road, but over time, it became very clear to me that the idea of governing, good governance, requires that coalition building with variety of people from a variety of points of view, and quite frankly, in Michigan, from a variety of communities throughout the state. It's a big state, but the Upper Peninsula has been served well over the years, and with the exception of the term limits that put a damper on the ability for members to be elected, men and women, to serve a period of time and gain more seniority and thus gain positions of power from which they can deliver what is needed for the Upper Peninsula. That has been a really good, strong era that you speak of, from 1975 to 95. Yes.
The 75, 95. So it's harder to become an insider today because of term limits.
I think it is. People have a shorter period of time to get things done and build relationships than they used to, which I don't think, and I've always felt this, is not a good idea. To me, the election is the term limits. If someone's not doing a good job, the voters have that choice. That's been taken away from them through the arbitrary term limits. We aren't going to have Dominic Jacobettis. We aren't going to have Rusty Hellmans and people who over the years built that seniority by building relationships and coalitions that did things that needed to be done in a bipartisan way for the people of the Upper Peninsula.
So you know, during that era, as you described, there was a great deal of seniority from the Upper Peninsula delegation. And they held powerful positions. Dominic Jacobetti, chair of the powerful House Appropriations Committee, elected in 1954, and he becomes, in 75, that era, he becomes chair of appropriations, I think it's the date. Rusty Hellman, you mentioned, was a powerful capital outlay. You were DNR committee. How did you all work to pull the UP and Detroit's downstate Michigan together to get things through?
Well, that's a really good question, David, because the way we apportion districts, it's per population. One person, one vote. So in my case, when I was first elected, I represented 19 counties in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, part of the Upper Peninsula. And there were counties downstate. I had 19 counties. There's one county downstate that had that many members of the legislature. So it's always more difficult, and it does require that you develop relationships and work together in a cooperative basis. And I can recall my first term, we had, and for a number of years, a Republican governor, William Milliken, and a Democratic legislature, both the House and the Senate. That changed over time, but I think that forced Michigan and its leaders to work together. For example, in the Upper Peninsula, we had a couple of Republican members of the state legislature from northern Michigan in the Upper Peninsula, Charlie Barnum out of Manistee, and we had a fellow by the name of Ralph Osling out of Roscommon area. And it was very clear that when we went into meetings to work on issues for the people in northern Michigan, you checked your partisanship at the door. And that isn't always the case in some areas of this state. And it was also very clear that the long-term relationship that was built, and I credit people like Dominic Jacobetti, I credit people like Jack Gingras, who served, and I credit people that came along a little bit later, like the Pat Gagliardis. All of us had an obligation to carry on a rich tradition of working with members of other communities, such as Detroit, such as Lansing, such as Flint. And those relationships were long-term, and they were based on mutual respect. They were based on bipartisanship and a little horse trading here and there in order to accomplish the goals that were set out by members of both the UP and downstate. And particularly the relationship with Detroit, where you had a mayor of Detroit for many, many years who had been a state senator and who knew the members of the legislature and was very strong with the Black Caucus, the members of the African-American community who were in the legislature. And they often had a lot of things in common, such as often being ignored, such as having a great number of poor folks in their constituency. and having economic problems that required sometimes an incentive from the state of Michigan or a change in the law to make sure that our companies could expand and grow jobs. And that became synergistic. And one of the interesting side notes of history is that a lot of people would say, well, how come the Upper Peninsula and how come Detroit's always work well together? I said, you know, that's been going on, at least in my memory, historically speaking. In 1874, the city attorney of Detroit was none other than James Brown, who later moved to the North Country, settled in St. Agnes, and his son became the United States Senator, Prentice Brown. And his other offspring have all been active in public service. And quite frankly, between Republican Governor George Osborne and Democratic Senator Brown, Prentice Brown, tied with Soapy Williams, that's how we got the Mackinac Bridge. So that synergy has been there. People forget too that people like Walker Sisler, who was chairman of the Detroit Edison, Lake Superior State University in Sault Ste. Marie has its student center named the Walker Sisler Center. Why? Because of that synergy and interest between the community of Detroit and the Upper Peninsula. So not that we agree on everything, let me tell you, there was quite a few, but those disagreements pale in comparison to the relationship that Gagliardi had, for example, on appropriation, and we had in the Senate side with our colleagues downstate.
So Mitch, you mentioned to me the other day when we were talking about this interview, and I'd like you to expand on it for our audience, that one of the things that you did and other legislators did, Jake did it for years and you continued, and Governor Blanchard and Governor Milliken and Governor Granholm did this, and that is push people from the UP to take leadership roles in state agencies, that placing them there, not only as directors. Today we have, I think, 2 cabinet members from the UP, State Police and Agriculture are both UP folks. Talk about how that worked and why it was important.
Well, it worked on a simple basis of relationships between the lawmakers and the governor and the governor's office and the communities. And whenever there was an opening, it was very clear that people would like to see Northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula represented. And over the years, whether it be Transportation Commission, DNR Commission, you name it, there was always the question, is there someone from Northern Michigan in the Upper Peninsula placed there and earn an appointment to do the job to speak for the people of the North Country? And Gagliardi was a master at this, as I learned in my first few years, because there were many Northern grads, and in the Department of Transportation, I was surprised occasionally to run into someone who wasn't a Michigan Tech grad, who had an engineering degree and somehow ended up doing major league work for the Michigan Department of Transportation. One of the famous meetings I went to, one of the leading engineers was at a meeting. We were working on a project in Delta County. Anyway, long story short, his name happened to be Sam Kreideman. And I'm usually one to make a small talk, ask someone, well, where are you from? Where's your home? Where'd you grow up? He says, same town as you. So what? I'm from Rudyard, a little small town, 500 people, including dogs, cats, and all of my family's horses and cows when we were growing up. And Sam says, yes, we lived on, didn't even have a street name, but we lived in that little small log cabin there. And my mom, did you know Ida Kreideman? And I said, Ida Kreideman, I delivered the newspapers. So that's the kind of thing you get in the Upper Peninsula. And all the delegation, all the members of the House and the Senate would always, when they learned from town meetings, from parents or superintendents or principals or teachers, that someone had some promise and had some interest in serving, then they made sure that they got a fair shake at an interview for a civil service job, or in the case of a board or a commission, that they were given fair consideration. And quite frankly, there was a study done one time, can't remember the exact numbers, but when the former mayor of Marquette, who's not with us anymore, Tom Baldini, was the governor's Upper Peninsula representative, there was a study done about what's our population versus the number of appointments to boards and commissions by the governor. And I will say, without bragging, that it was a little lopsided But our argument to that was always, that's because we have more, our folks have more experience in a wider region to cover. And it always worked out that way. Milliken was that way. Governor Blanchard was that way during that era you're speaking of. Yep. So I think the UP's always been heard. And like Jacobetti would say, we never have enough. And we don't have enough wheelbarrows to haul that cash across the Mackinac Bridge either for special projects.
So all those outsiders, they were these insiders from the UP in Northern Michigan, were outsiders to Lansing. And by helping them get into civil service jobs and high-level appointment jobs from government, they became Lansing insiders, which helped all of you bring the UP message to those insiders who were from the UP.
Absolutely.
It made a difference, right?
Absolutely.
To get your thing done.
Absolutely.
You know, when you were in, I think the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and the governor was a Republican, right. And so there was a forced. A lot of people believe there was more bipartisanship forced by that. And during that period of time, having worked in the legislature during part of that time, I remember times it wasn't very bipartisan. It's a nice memory, but was it from your perspective on the insider outsider? Was it an era when elected officials and appointed officials were more willing to work together? It was less confrontational. What was it that so much got done during that period of time?
I agree with you. And this insider outsider is almost like having a shirt in basketball practice. You'd flip the inside or the outside, you had a different color. Well, like I said earlier, we would take, when you get into the meeting room, you check your partisanship at the door. And absolutely. And I think it has to do with partly the leadership style. You look at the leadership style of a Soapy Williams, who I served with when he was on the Supreme Court. You take Bill Milliken, couldn't be a finer gentleman, more decent person. He was a Republican, but he had a bipartisan spirit and worked well with everyone. And Jim Blanchard was the same. Once term limits came into place, that has been a tripwire for more partisan activity. But not to say negative things about it, wish it were different, but it's not. I would say that people work at it, and people from the Upper Peninsula are almost forced. When you go into the legislative process, or you're a member of a board or a commission, you're usually outnumbered. So I've always said it takes more talent and more competence for someone from the North and Upper Peninsula to be able to be effective maneuvering within the government on the inside, because there's only one of you. I mean, we got 15 counties in the UP, and that's a lot for someone to represent, but they do it by staying in constant communication with their leaders. Lawmakers have town hall meetings. They have meetings with their mayors and the city council. They have office hours and the like, where they keep in touch. And mostly the UP lawmakers that you have in the history, they were born and raised in the Upper Peninsula. Very few carpetbaggers, so to speak, and that they knew their communities well. And because they were there a long period of time, they worked hard, they got reelected, they had seniority, had key committee structures and appointments, they were able to keep in connection with their leaders. And that's why I think the issues of the region, whether it be in the Central Michigan, Upper Peninsula region, or the Eastern end, or the Western end, whoever represented those areas had some definite close relationships with those leaders. And quite frankly, the UP is one of the few areas that had a lot of UP-wide organizations that tried to bring together road commissioners, tried to bring together mayors, tried to bring together church leaders, tried to bring together people that had a common interest in the forest industry or tourism. So I think it's pretty clear that the UP is a very special place because of that, geography being so far away and how we were forced to come together. Even when you weren't sure you really liked someone all that well, you knew their heart was in the right place, and you would forego any of that pettiness and say, okay, David, you may be an SOB, but you know what? You're our SOB, and we're going to work together and get the job done.
Well, Mitch, thank you very much. It's been a great discussion of the insider-outsider in the world of Michigan politics, and it's It's good to see you, and it's good that you're back home in the UP from
Thank you.
downstate. You're welcome, and thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
All right.
So, Dan, if it's okay, I'm going to ask Pat a question, and then I don't know if we have any questions from viewers. I don't see any on the screen yet, so Pat will just watch his questions pop up. So, you know, that was filmed in my living room in Marquette, thanks to COVID. And I should also point out that Mitch, for those people in the Central UP, is the new developer and owner of the new Marriott Hotel going up in Marquette. So he's got a Marquette tie as well. So Pat, other than what struck me during the hearing is I can't figure out how come Mitch has more hair than I do after all these years. But other than his hair and my lack of hair, do you have any reactions to what Mitch said, or any further explanations?
Well, I do, David. I knew that wasn't filmed at your hunting camp, judging from the background. That's obviously a very nice living room, and you and Senator Irwin have done very well in life. Congratulations. I have so much respect for my friend Mitch. He's just a great speaker and has great ideas. And he brought up some things that made me think so much when he talked about Upers being involved in boards, commissions on the cabinet of governors. If you think about this governor, Governor Whitmer, one of her first appointments was Department of Ag, Gary McDowell out of Rudyard, State Police, Gasper's there. Mike Prusi, the former state rep and state senator out of Marquette, was her first representative for all of the UP. And then I kind of tagged along later as chair of the commission. But there's been a lot of appointments to the boards, like the university boards and other boards that always have a good, solid UP man and woman to it. To his point about more bipartisanship back then, the arguments back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s were tough arguments. And there's no doubt about it. There were tough arguments. There were votes on the floor where all the Republicans were one way and all the Democrats were the other way. They were fewer and far between, I believe. If you can think of this, in 1978, in your term here of 75 to 95, you had the first elected Black Democratic mayor of Detroit support a Republican, Bill Milliken, for re-election over a state senator from Mayor Young's own community, Detroit, Bill Fitzgerald. Now, I don't think you'd see that today. And that speaks to a lot of changing that's gone on. And where we'll be in the future, I'm sure we'll change some more. So I'm upbeat about where we go in the future. But I think hopefully a style of coalition building, bringing people to the table, as Senator Irwin said, you know, checking your egos and your partisanship at the door, trying to get things done. We've watched it happen time and time again. And that's why I think we have done so well as a unit from the Upper Peninsula, even through now. I think that there are successes, and we hope for more successes in the future.
Pat, one other question I would have as sort of a review from your era, our era is, and today is, what do you think are an issue or two that has carried on from that period of 75 to 95 that's still an issue for the people of the UP as it relates to public policy? What strikes you as some things that haven't been resolved that need to be resolved for rural areas? Whether it's
I think the biggest need is technology, without a doubt. I think you and Marquette have been leaders in it over the years. Northern Michigan's been involved in it, but there are vast areas of our region and vast areas of the rural area of Michigan that don't have technology. They don't have broadband. They don't have broadband strength. They don't have cell service. right now when many children in urban areas and suburban areas are still going to school virtually. You can't do that in many areas of our region because they don't have good enough service in each and every home to deliver technology to children over the internet. I think that's our biggest long-term need. If you look at the East End from where you're at, David, and Marquette, all the way through the East End, we're still on a rural electric cooperative. There is no big private sector business that's coming to the UP from the central end all the way through the East End to deliver electric service. If we didn't have the ability, and this goes back to Franklin Roosevelt for rural electric cooperatives and the money that the federal government put in to lay all those lines over the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We wouldn't have electricity, and we still don't in big areas. In my old district, north of Newberry, over to Paradise, that whole area up there, beautiful lakes, and a number of summer homes, there's still no electricity, and there won't be because the cost of running it now. And that's just one chunk of many in the UP. We need to have a rural electrification, a rural technological growth package by the federal government for this country. Why? So much is being done just like we're doing it right here. You can do your work from home. There would be so many of our children that would move back to the Upper Peninsula and work if they had the ability. And there are some areas like around Marquette where you've done a good job and you had a lot of help doing it. But we, in many, many other areas, need a lot of help. So
one last thing, I know Dan probably wants us to end soon for the next session, but what would you say to young people in the Upper Peninsula who look at lives and careers? Talk a little bit about going to work in state government, local government, and the advantages of that and how important it is to the culture of the UP.
Well, there's this very simple culture of the UP. It's called hard work. It's taught to us early. And going back to my grandfather's time, if you came down from the Upper Peninsula to the city to get a job, you told people you were from the Upper Peninsula, you'd just about get hired anyway because they know there was a good work ethic up there. So I think and you can see it with the legislators. I look at Mitch, I think about Jake. Jake was going back and forth, Joe Mack, Rusty Hellman, those guys were going back and forth before there was expressways, before there was a bridge in Mackinac City to St. Ignace. I mean, it was, when Jake got elected in the 50s, you went down to Lansing for 3 weeks and you went home for a week. I mean, you were gone a lot because of that. So it took a lot of hard work to not only take care of your constituencies, but also work within the Lansing power structure to get something done. So I think what I would always say to the young people in our area, use what we are taught. And the basis of what we are taught is hard work. You can go anywhere with that ethic. You can do anything with that ethic. You will learn anything you want to learn with that ethic, but keep your nose to the grindstone, outwork your competition, outwork the people that want your job, and you will be fine. And you will become a leader because that ethic is so important now, as important as ever before. And I think we've got it. I think it's ingrained in us as we come from this rural area of the state. And I'm very proud to say that we're tough.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate your contribution and taking the time to do this. And I appreciate Mitch Irwin, former Senator Irwin, being willing to do it. He's having some minor surgery today, which prevented him from doing it live. So that's why we cut the tape. But thank you very much. And thanks for that perspective. And we hope to do more of this to make sure we preserve some of the thoughts and comments and advice from past legislators of both parties.
Thank you. Let me end by saying, when I talk about toughness, what Jake used to tell us all the time: when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
I remember him saying
that. David? Remember that, David?
I do remember that all the time. That's a great line.
We do have a few minutes left before the next session starts. And if anyone wants to type in a question, they can do that. But I have a question. We did an exhibit on UP statehood initiatives recently. And of course, Jake pushed pretty hard for it in the late 70s. But the question that everyone had was he really serious, or was this really a bargaining chip he was using to get more funding from the state of Michigan? What do you guys take on that?
So my first take on it is, I'd be interested in Pat's, was Jake, it was a great way for Jake to draw attention to the UP, not only with the media, and then it was a brilliant sort of, I got it, the statehood made you think about the UP. It brought the UP to the front. Jake was a very sophisticated guy in the political world and policy, and he knew the chances of becoming a state was mighty, mighty slim. Just ask Puerto Rico and Hawaii and all the others, that Guam, that want to be or have been in that. He understood that. But it was a very brilliant play from my perspective of making sure that it never was out of anybody else's mind. If the issue went by on something else, we could always raise the statehood issue. Pat, that's...
I agree wholeheartedly with what you said, David. That's a good analysis. I will tell you how important our delegation was, and how important to the people that Mitch and I have talked about with you today, Don Jacobetti and Morris Hood Jr. from Detroit. For the last 20 some years, a quarter of a century since Jake has passed, a little over maybe now in 94. Since that time, they still talk about all the money that Jacobetti took back across the bridge for places like Northern Michigan University and other things. And it's still being talked about in Lansing. I mean, that's a long legacy, Dan, if you think of that, a long, long legacy. He was, and I agree with his assessment on the state. What David had that's good analysis, David.
Thanks, Pat. Anything else, Dan, you want to ask?
Well, no, but I just want to comment. One of my favorite stories about Jake is his retirement party at Northern in the Great Lakes rooms. And Fred Stonehouse says that at the very end, they said, okay, if anyone wants to present Jake with a gift, and there was a line around the entire Great Lakes rooms of people giving things. And he said it was like Nero on the, receiving the tributes, and which I just thought was funny. But the great thing is a lot of that stuff is now in our collection because we have the Jacobetti collection here at Northern, and the Beaumier Center has a lot of them are plaques. We have plaques, more plaques to Jake than you can imagine. Also, about 10 years ago, I managed to display in the Dome that we have things for Jake there. And I got a call someday, he says, we have a plaque we want to give to Jake. Can we put it in there? And I thought, he's dead. He's been dead for like a decade. Yeah, but we want to give him a plaque. So even in death, he was receiving plaques from various organizations for what he had done for them. And
well, I still remember, thanks, Dan. I still remember real quickly the things he used to tell us, like when the going get tough, the tough get going. He used to say things like, God must have loved the poor because he made so many of them. We were so poor during the Depression, we couldn't afford to go window shopping. Just the Jake-isms that I remember, and he's been gone a quarter of a century, are incredible, but that's the kind of impact important people have. And important people, I'm just so proud to say that he was a mentor to me. He was a mentor to all of us, as Mitch has said, as Mike Prusi will tell you, or Don Koivisto, or any of us that are still around. It's just an impressive legacy. But remember this, he was the longest serving legislator ever in Michigan's history. And with term limits, if that stays forever, that will never be broken. It will always be his.
That's great. Well, that's a great way to end this. Gentlemen, thank you so much. David, thanks for getting Pat and Mitch involved. this has been just a fantastic session and could go all day, but we'll have to call it there and move on to the next thing. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Adios.
Adios.
Adios.